Hello and welcome to the third episode of Ponsonby and Massie, a new political podcast looking at politics in Scotland and politics viewed from Scotland. We're recording this the day after the first leaders' debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And Bernard Ponsonby, the fallout from this continues. What's your view of how things are unfolding in the war to win the spin war in the aftermath of the first of these encounters?
Well, I suppose that the main headline from last night's debate was the Prime Minister's attack on Keir Starmer. And of course, we were discussing last night how it took the Labour leader 27 minutes to try and answer this charge about £2,000. But we were also discussing in last night's podcast the way in which this was deployed by the Prime Minister, where he clearly implied that this had the backing of the Treasury. Well, there's always a story, there's always a day two, and the day two appears to be that the Treasury are distancing themselves from the kind of charge that the Prime Minister made. So, was he sleek-it? Was he telling lies? At the end of the day, as I said last night, my sense of this is that people ain't listening. The polls, and we'll talk about them later on, are all suggesting that the Prime Minister, well, as you put it the other day, he's got the wind in his face, not at his back.
Yes, and one of the things that also became apparent last night was the viewing figures. ITV's debate was viewed by about 4.8 million people at its height. That's not the audience looking at proceedings throughout the show, but and this was rather less than comparable debates from the 2019 election, which suggests, I would say, that perhaps quite a lot of voters are not yet fully engaged with this campaign, and quite a lot may never become fully engaged with this campaign because they look at the opinion polls and they think, well, I kind of know what's going to happen.
And less than half of the height at the first leaders' debate in 2010, which peaked at 10.4 million viewers.
Well, we have lots of numbers to talk about this in this episode, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined to discuss these issues by Professor Ailsa Henderson, Professor of Political Science at Edinburgh University. Ailsa has many strings to her bow. She's a boundary commissioner, which is a wonderful title, and we're going to talk about what that means and her role in creating the constituencies, the new constituencies that are being contested at this general election for the first time. She's also a prominent feature of BBC Scotland's election night coverage. She'll be doing a 12-hour shift there overnight, which is something I imagine you can sympathise with, Bernard. And we're going to talk about MRP polling, the various different models that are used to project what the likely outcome on a constituency-by-constituency basis, and what MRP means, these new sort of fancy stat polling that has become terribly fashionable and doubtless very expensive to conduct. And then we're also going to talk about the threat of Tory Armageddon and look at some of the historical precedents for what happens when the herd really moves against an incumbent political party. And here we're also delighted to have Ailsa, because we're going to talk about the Canada 93 election, which saw the wipeout of the Conservative Party in Canada. And Ailsa is a bona fide Canadian, and so we couldn't have anyone better to talk about all of these issues than her. So welcome to the show, Ailsa. And Bernard, over to you.
Well, Ailsa's going to be doing this very long night on election night with the BBC. And so what we're hoping to do in this podcast is to give you an idea of the shape of the electoral map as it currently looks, what it might look like on the new boundaries. And this will be quite instructive. Perhaps point out one or two constituencies to watch on the night as the results come in. Just to give some sort of context and shape, where are we on the basis of the result in 2019? Well, the SNP won 48 seats, the Conservatives won 6, the Liberal Democrats won 4, and Labour won 1 seat. In terms of vote share, the SNP had 45%, the Conservatives 25%. Their polling, of course, is way down on that percentage share. The Liberal Democrats 9.5%, and Labour at 19%. We'll come back to talk about, on the first past the post basis, why around about 45% is a key figure because lots of constituencies start to drop at that point. Now, because all of the boundaries have changed, Scotland has lost 2 seats. We're now at 57 seats. Professor Henderson is going to talk us through this idea of the notional result, but in very, very crude terms, if the patterns of support in 2019 were replicated on the new boundaries, the psephologists Rawlings and Thrasher, you'll be hearing a lot about them in the coming weeks, reckon that of the 57 seats, we're losing 2, remember, the SNP, based upon 2019 patterns of support, would still have 48 seats, Labour would still have 1 seat, the Liberal Democrats would have 2 seats, and the Conservatives would have 6 seats. So that's the broad picture. Let's now talk about this issue of notional seats and how Rawlings and Thrasher have gone about making this prediction. Professor Henderson, over to you, because this is mostly always above my head.
Okay, so I think it's important to outline how much things have changed and why things have changed in Scotland. And so it's not just the fact that we've gone from 59 to 57 seats, but part of the rule change for this current review was that we had to be much closer to the electoral quota than in previous years. So we took the total electorate in the UK and we divided by the number of constituencies minus the protected constituencies. And that gave us a quota figure, 73,393. And we have to be within 5% of that figure. And so that means that we are entitled to 55 seats plus the 2 protected seats in Scotland. And so we have to not just keep in mind the number of seats that we need, but also we have to stick very close to that quota figure. And so as a result, the boundaries were changing partly because of the drop in numbers, but also partly because of that need to stay really tightly to the quota. And I think that's really important to understand because for boundary reviews, for Holyrood elections, we have much more room to maneuver. We have much less room to maneuver in UK boundary reviews. And it means sometimes the boundaries are not ideally where you'd like them to be. They cut entirely through communities. They're very large in areas of Scotland where population density is low. So that's kind of the background to this. So what Rawlings and Thrasher have done and said, right, let's assume that everyone cast their ballot the same way in 2019, but rather than having the 59 constituencies, we now have 57. What would that look like? Now, in many parts of Scotland, there's not much of a change. But in some parts of Scotland, we are actually, when we create these new constituencies, we're combining 2 parts that actually backed different parties last time round. And so they want to model what would that have looked like if we had this new constituency last time round. Now, in areas where you actually have voting results at ward level, you can stitch the constituencies back up together by using that ward level data. But actually, we're pretty poor at collecting and releasing ward level data. So what they rely on are local election results. And they look at those at ward level and they use those to build back up to constituency profiles. Now, there's certain challenges with that. The first is that we have a completely different electoral system for local elections in Scotland. We vote not by first past the post, but by STV. So we're ranking candidates. And we also know that people back different parties in local contests than they do in UK contests. And the other thing that's particularly relevant in certain parts of Scotland is that it doesn't quite handle independent candidates particularly well. And so we know, for example, in Highland, in 16 of the 21 wards in the last local elections, there were independent candidates elected in each of those wards. And the presence of those independent candidates then makes it very hard to use Scottish local election results as a building block for what these new notional results might be. But what they're doing basically is taking the parts and building back up at ward level on the basis of local election results to come up with the figures that you identified earlier.
And that means that on election night, the BBC and other broadcasters are going to say that although the Liberal Democrats currently hold the Westminster seat of North East Fife, it is considered
Exactly.
an SNP seat.
Exactly.
And when you talk about the two protected seats, those are obviously the Western Isles and Orkney and Shetland. But every mainland constituency, if you like, has to be within a few hundred people in terms of population of that quota figure of 73,000. So how do you actually go about drawing these new boundaries? I mean, because Glasgow, you lost a seat and a seat was lost from northeast Scotland. But how do you maintain a balance between ensuring that constituencies have a kind of coherent geographical idea, which is important in British politics, or at least has been historically? It's very different from, say, congressional districts in the United States that are gerrymandered to the nth degree and don't really represent real places. And is there a thing where you want to try and keep Westminster constituencies as close as possible to Scottish parliamentary constituencies, or within council boundaries, or how does that process work, and what trade-offs do you have to operate?
Yes. So the first thing we do is we identify the quota. So the quota applies to the UK as a whole, and then we take constituencies that exist within local authority areas, and we build multiple local authority areas together into groups. And so we divide Scotland not into 32 local authority areas, but into clusters of local authority areas. And we try and do that in a way that identifies a theoretical entitlement to a certain number of MPs. And we try and keep that theoretical entitlement as close to whole numbers as possible, because then you're not systematically over-representing or under-representing certain areas. And then within those clusters, we try and identify constituency solutions that keep in mind the different rules that we have to play with. So attention to parity, we try and avoid disrupting local ties, we take into consideration special geographic circumstances. So how easy is it to travel around a constituency? How easy would it be for a representative to cover a particular area? And we look at where communities are. And so we look not just at the existing lines of where the constituencies are, but we look at local authority boundaries. We look at community council boundaries. Sometimes we look at school catchment boundaries as well, to give us a sense of where the lived communities are. And the Secretariat is responsible, the civil servants that staff the Secretariat, they draw up a number of different options for us, and we look at each of them and say, well, this one fits the rules a little bit better, or these two seem equally fine, this one's a bit more controversial, let's put that out to the public, see what they think. And then they write in and they say, no, we don't like that one at all, because you've drawn the boundary right through some communities. And we move the boundaries. We also move the groupings if we think we need to.
Because historically, places like East Renfrewshire and other Glasgow suburbs and so on have been absolutely adamant at both a council level, but also I think at a parliamentary constituency level, that they want to have absolutely nothing to do with the city of Glasgow themselves. And that sort of thing becomes quite controversial in boundary reviews.
It does, and we have multiple rounds of consultation. One thing that also separates Westminster reviews from Holyrood reviews is that we go out to consultation 2.5 times. We have our initial proposals, we do a primary consultation. We then release all the results of that primary consultation and have a secondary consultation so that people can write in and say, well, those people who were complaining about the boundary being there, I actually like where the boundary is, so I'm glad you've put it there. Then we make some changes, we have revised proposals, we go back out, and that's the full second consultation on revised proposals. But after that, it ends.
Well, we have the boundaries that we have. So let's interrogate a little bit more these idea of notional seats. I can remember when the boundaries changed before the 92 general election. The Gordon constituency, which was at that point represented in the House of Commons by the then Scottish Liberal Democrat leader Malcolm Bruce, was notionally Conservative. And of course, he got very, very upset about this. But when it came to the point, when it came to actual election day, he held the constituency. Now, I'm just wondering if this idea of the notional results, does it play against any one party, Ailsa? The reason I'm asking that is that on the notional results based on 2019, they've got the Liberal Democrats down. For example, they've got North East Fife in the SNP column, Caithness and Sutherland.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
away back 1966, George Mackey won it. Then Robert McLennan won it for Labour. Then the Alliance held it. Edinburgh West, perhaps a slightly special and separate case. But is this idea of notionality, which perhaps doesn't take into account more rural constituencies where voters might go for the man or the woman rather than the party, does notionality pick that up?
No, it doesn't. And I think that's part of the problem. It uses local voting patterns to build up notional results, which is problematic. It ignores incumbency effects, which we know make a difference, as you're alluding to, but it also ignores tactical voting. And I think that's something, if you understand Scottish politics in a post-independence referendum world, you have to understand that there is a high level of tactical voting occurring. Now, we have two forms of tactical voting, anti-SNP tactical voting and anti-conservative tactical voting. That second one is the kind of classic form of tactical voting you get in Scottish elections. But what we're seeing in the last 10 years really is the growth of anti-SNP tactical voting. It is the main game in town, really. And I think the way these constituencies have been built up into notional results very much ignores the existence of pro-union tactical voting. And the fact you've mentioned Northeast 5 and Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, I mean, those are important constituencies because they are of the four kinds where you have parts that supported very different parties last time round coming together. The other, of course, Gordon and Buchan, and then Murray West as well. So I think in the way that they've built that up, they have ignored the existence of pro-union tactical voting. I would have put those still as Lib Dem seats in a notional result. The other interesting thing, of course, is that they have flipped Gordon and Buchan and Murray West. So if you look at the map right now and you look at the colour in that part of the country, you would say Gordon and Buchan, SNP, and Murray West going to the Conservatives. The notional results have flipped that, calling Gordon and Buchan for the Conservatives and Murray West for the SNP. So I think there's some things that are missed in the nuances of Scottish voting when you're building up, particularly on the basis of local election results.
And that difference between the situation in Scotland and the situation elsewhere in the UK is also a real challenge for pollsters, isn't it? And perhaps that provides a good opportunity to move on to the challenge of polling in this election and the new fashion for these MRP polls. Now, MRP, I gather, stands for multi-level regression and post-stratification. I have absolutely no idea, none whatsoever, what that means. That might as well be in Chinese, for all I understand what it means, and so on. Ailsa, can you give us an explanation of what that means? And bear in mind that here, when it comes to this sort of highfalutin statistical analysis and so on, you are dealing with people who have a sort of statistical age of 7, perhaps.
I don't believe that for a minute. Yes, I can explain it. It's basically a process in 2 stages. So the first stage of this is to conduct a really big survey, much bigger than normal. So we're not talking a sample of 1,000. We're talking tens of thousands of people. And we use that information to gather data on people's vote intention and how they're planning to cast a ballot in the next election. And in that same survey, we gather demographic and socioeconomic information about individuals. And we use that information to create models that tell us what kind of person votes Labour, what kind of person votes for the SNP, what kind of person votes Conservative. And we take that model and we park it. And then we go back out and we gather aggregate level information about constituencies. Because however big that sample is, that much larger sample than we normally get, it's still not big enough for us to understand exactly what's going on in constituencies. So we need another source of data to tell us about constituencies. And what we do there is we gather other information, usually from the census, to build up a socioeconomic demographic profile of a particular constituency. And we use that information to say, those kinds of people that vote Labour, well, there's this many of them in this constituency. Those kinds of people that tend to vote Conservative, there's this many of them in this constituency. So it's multi-level in the sense that you're using individual level and aggregate level information. It's regression because you're using models to help model vote intention. And it's post-stratification because you're then looking at the different profiles of areas to build up a vision of what's going to happen on the night.
I think I understood that. I think I may have understood that.
I think I may have understood it. I think I may have understood it as well. Let's, now that we've got that, we've had this YouGov super poll, Ailsa, which the other evening was not only giving us the headline figures about what each of the parties will have in the House of Commons, but it was drilling down to give predictions, which should come with lots and lots of health warnings probably, about what was happening in individual constituencies. Now, people were getting very, very excited by this, and I'm sure that Labour people were getting really, really excited by it. And I suspect that a lot of SNP people were getting really quite depressed by that. And again, just to give this bit of the discussion a little bit of context, based upon that YouGov super poll, and again, looking on the new constituencies, they were projecting, and we'll come back and qualify this in a minute, they were projecting 34 seats for Labour, 17 seats for the SNP, 5 for the Conservatives, and 1 for the Liberal Democrats. Now, I'll put my head in the chopping block. That ain't going to happen. The Liberal Democrats will have more than 1 seat. We could come back and talk about the dynamics in certain constituencies, about where the Conservatives might end up. But let's just, in terms of those figures, how much of and we do this on election night, we get the first result, we put lots of qualifications on it in terms of where the swing goes. When we've got 6 or 7 results in, and we can see a little bit of a trend, we stick our neck out a little further. When we've got about 12 to 15 results in, we're beginning to get really quite confident about how other constituencies might behave because we've got more information. But in those figures, 34 Labour, 17 SNP, 5 Conservatives, 1 Liberal Democrats. How much of a health warning do we need to put in those figures?
Massive, absolutely massive. And YouGov's very good, actually, at saying we're dealing with probabilities and likelihood. We're not predicting, and so they're careful to say that these are tendencies, these are probabilities. But the other thing they're very careful to point out is that this is not a contract. This is a snapshot of how people say they would vote right now, this far out from the election. It's not an exit poll. It's not people saying how they've just cast a ballot. And so there's health warnings around the method. There's also health warnings around the timing. And that's why they update those MRP figures as the campaign goes on. But they're very careful to point out that they would expect 30 to 40 of these calls to be wrong. And so on that basis, we would assume that of the Scottish figures, we would assume that 3 to 4 of those calls would be wrong. But actually, it's worth remembering that if we look at their MRP, they've been doing this for a couple elections now. If we look at their MRP results from 2019, they called 7 contests in Scotland wrong. Now, they're very careful to say, oh, it's too close to call. They will still call it when they say it's too close to call. So they would maybe be better to grey out the map when it's within 2, 3, 4 percentage points. But they called 7 wrong last time. And they're the 7 that there's some of the ones that we've been talking about already in terms of the ones where the notional results don't seem quite right.
Again, just to give a little bit of, I'll just make this very quick point. Again, just to give this a little bit of context, 34 Labour, 17 SNP, 5 Conservatives, 1 Liberal Democrat. On 12 constituencies, they were putting it down to a toss-up, but they were calling them for Labour. So, I mean, if they're just out just by a little, you could put 12 onto the SNP column and take 12 off the Labour column. That's just how marginal we're dealing with here. So if there are any people who are out watching this podcast knocking on doors who are SNP canvassers and they're going 17 seats, oh my God, just listen to what we're saying in terms of the health warnings in this kind of polling. Alec.
Yeah, I mean,
I wouldn't put money on it. That's the other thing. I wouldn't part with any money at the bookies on it.
and this is
cancel that in any
yeah, I mean, this is within the context, of course, that, YouGov's MRP poll, which came out on Monday, and we got another one from Survation on Tuesday, which we'll talk about as well. But the YouGov one suggested that across the UK, the Tories would be reduced to 140 seats, which would be their worst result in any election since 1906. They would lose 225 of the seats they hold at the moment. Labour would have 422 seats. Then the Survation poll, MRP, another MRP, obviously using a slightly different model. And this is where we get into some interesting stuff, I think. It suggested that Labour might win 487 seats across the UK. The Liberal Democrats 43, the SNP 26, which is actually within the sort of margin for error when you consider the number of sort of toss-up constituencies there are in Scotland. So it's not that a finding of 26 SNP isn't necessarily very different from a finding of 17 SNP. It just depends how many of those coin tosses go the SNP's way. But the Survation poll found that the Tories would be reduced to 71 seats across the UK at the moment, according to their MRP. So that suggests that there are obviously quite some significant differences, I would suggest, in the multi-level regression and post-stratification models being used by the different pollsters. And that doesn't mean that one of them is right and the other is wrong, but what do we actually know about the different way in which different pollsters can construct these deep dives into the electorate?
Well, the basic process is the same. Where I think you see the major differences are in the fact that different pollsters have different levels of vote intention for the different parties. So if you start from that basis, then what you're doing to model those differences then has knock-on consequences. So we know that there are differences in the pollsters in terms of who mentions, when you ask people how they're going to vote, you can have a long list and include, in Scotland, you can include Reform, you can include ALBA, whereas other pollsters just say another party, and then they force you to go to another question and then indicate who you're going to vote for, that you're going to vote for the Greens or you're going to vote for Reform. And we know that when those other parties, those smaller parties, are mentioned in the first question, it has an effect of elevating support for those parties. So that's one difference. Another difference is how we treat unlikely voters. So we ask all voters, or we ask all respondents, how likely are you to cast a ballot on a scale of 0 to 10? And over the years, pollsters have used that information in different ways to include or exclude different respondents in their models. So it used to be that YouGov would exclude everyone who wasn't a 9 or a 10. But around the time after the 2015 election, where the pollsters had a bit of a shock and were worried that they weren't getting things right, they started to play around with those figures much more in 2017. And they started to ignore how people said they were voting. And they would only look at you if you said you voted in the last election, or the last election and the last referendum. And actually, we found in 2017 that the people who were massaging the numbers more and trusting the responses less actually had more inaccurate results at the end of the day. So by 2019, they're back to pretty much trusting the question about whether you're likely to vote. But some people chuck out everyone who gives a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and others exclude only the zeros and then weight everybody else proportionately. So it's less that there are differences in the MRP process, and it's more that there are differences from the start in the vote intention figures. And that's explained by basic changes in polling methodology.
Yeah. So it's the numbers you plug in that help determine aspects of the results you get out. Because that's fascinating, because I looked at some of the constituency by constituency level things from both YouGov and Survation's MRP, and you saw really wild differences in some constituencies. Again, we've talked quite a bit about North East Fife, but this was an interesting one. I thought YouGov suggested that Reform and the Greens might take 15 to 20% of the vote in North East Fife, which struck me as being thoroughly implausible, I must say. say. I mean, I would happily wager £1,000 on that not happening. Whereas Salvation generally had much lower levels of support for reform and the Greens across Scotland, although very high levels of support for reform in many English constituencies, which intuitively feels more likely to me personally. But then again, across the UK, it's Salvation that say that the Conservatives might only win 70 or so seats, which is, that is wipeout territory.
I mean, another difference that exists across the pollsters is what they're saying about younger voters. So one thing YouGov's picking up that the others aren't picking up is this real reticence to cast a ballot from the youngest members of the electorate. They have 18 to 24-year-olds. They have about 20% of 18 to 24-year-olds saying they are 0 out of 10 likely to cast a ballot in this election. And that's double the figure that we saw before the 2019 election. So there's also differences across age in terms of voting likelihood that then filters into vote intention questions. So there's other things burbling along below the surface.
That's okay, an argument for raising the age at which people can vote, not lowering it.
Let's move on a bit, because we've explained the boundaries, we've explained the notional seats, we've explained, I think, Ailsa has explained fantastically the methodology in these polls, and let's sort of look at sort of the bigger picture on election night, because after the last election, Ailsa, when you actually looked at the results, there were probably a situation where we had more marginal and ultra-marginal constituencies in the country than certainly any time that I can remember. And let me just sort of ask you for your sort of big picture analysis of election night. It almost seems to me that there are two key contests going on in Scotland. One is predominantly central belt contests between Labour and the SNP, where that Conservative share across the country in 2019 of 25%, and they have a lot of support in central belt constituencies, on the basis of a tactical squeeze on the Conservative vote in these Labour SNP marginals, and any movement from the SNP to Labour, we could be seeing quite a number of seats change hand from SNP to Labour. But that's a sort of central belt dynamic. And the other one, in some respects, I think more fascinating, is those constituencies between the SNP and the Conservatives in the north and the northeast and the borders, because, of course, the starting point here in comparison to 2019 is that the SNP vote is down, but it will be nowhere near 45%, and the Conservative vote is down. So how should we read these north and northeast battlegrounds? Because I thought it was very interesting the other night on the Scottish Leaders debate. Douglas Ross and the Conservatives are clearly running a core vote strategy in the constituencies that they hold, and every bit of messaging is going to voters in those constituencies. So that's sort of my take on the sort of bigger picture in Scotland. What's your own view?
No, I'd agree with that. And until about a month ago, I was saying that the current polling looked like, yes, the SNP would lose seats to Labour, predominantly in the Central Belt, but the SNP, because it was not down by as much as the Conservative Party, they were actually within touching distance of being able to offset some of those losses, particularly in the Northeast, if they were able to galvanise that kind of remove the Conservatives from office vote. So I think that's very much the case. We've got two different kinds of marginal contests in Scotland, and they're not all in the same place. And I think also the other thing is that the decreased salience of both constitutional issues in this election, a decreased salience of support for independence or the union, but also the decreased salience of Brexit, takes us back to the way that voting was working before the 2014 election. And so we have to look at what the maps used to look like. I think the most instructive thing to do, if you want to understand tactical voting in this election, is actually to look at the map of the results in 1983, 1987, and you get a sense of how voters, pro-union voters in particular, might swing their vote behind entirely different parties, depending on where in Scotland they live.
Yeah, I mean, in a seat like Dumfries and Galloway, if you speak, which is Alistair Jack's seat, he's standing down. That's a seat that has been held by all three parties, main parties in this century. The Conservatives there accept that their vote might fall a little bit, but they are hoping that sufficient number of voters will defect from the SNP to Labour to offset the fall in the Conservative vote, that it'll be very close. All three parties could be around 30%, and the Tories, if you like, will come through the middle, splitting the difference and hold on to the seat. But it could go either way, and there are a number of other constituencies where that kind of dynamic may well be apparent.
And I don't envy you on election night, Ailsa. I don't envy you because we know that in a first past the post system, but when you start to get to about 44, 45% of the vote, 46%, they disproportionately start to fall in your favour. But if the SNP are down to somewhere around mid-30s and Labour are at sort of mid-30s, and the Conservative vote is down, and there's lots of tactical votes going on towards Labour in the Central Belt, perhaps even some tactical votes towards the SNP in the North and the North East. You might be lucky just to get away with a 12-hour shift, because it might be that we might be into rather a lot of recounts. I mean, there was a lot of contests last time around that were absolutely wafer-thin majorities. We could be back in this territory this time as well.
Well, and YouGov were very careful about that with their MRP model. They were saying Scottish contests are much more marginal than our English contests, and therefore there's more health warnings around the Scottish results of their model than for the English results. Just on the comment that there's multiple Scotlands in a way, I mean, the Scottish election study asked, back in the mists of time when we remember that Nicola Sturgeon was still First Minister, and there was talk of treating this election as a de facto referendum on independence. We thought, well, that's a brave move at any election to tell the voters this is what your election is about, and you'll pay attention to what this is about. But in this election in particular, we thought that was likely to be a brave move because of the changed salience of independence. So we asked voters, thinking of this election, what for you was a priority? And we had two options about constitutional preferences and two options about government formation. So was it maximizing pro-Indy MPs? Was it maximizing pro-union MPs? Was it keeping the Conservatives in office? And was it removing the Conservatives from office? And the Scottish electorate as a whole, the most popular answer by far is it's removing the Conservatives from office. This is the priority in this election. But if you actually break that down by different types of voters, by their constitutional preferences and also by their party preferences, we see very different trends there. So on yes voters, if you're a soft yes voter, you still prioritize removing the Conservatives from office rather than sending a constitutional message. It's only the very strongly yes that prioritize maximizing pro-union MPs. But if you're looking at Conservative supporters who are no voters, then actually they do not have as their priority keeping the Conservatives in office. Their priority is maximizing pro-union MPs. So we've got an asymmetry of constitutional salience, and it's not necessarily in that part of the electorate where you would expect it.
I mean, this is one of the weird things that I think that we see particularly in Conservative-held seats in Scotland, is that the Tories' weakness at a UK level actually helps the Conservatives in Scotland. Because I think that if this was a really knife-edge election across the UK, then the tactical voting imperative would be to kick all the Conservative MPs out of Scotland. But because most people now expect Labour to form a government, it is, if you like, safe to vote for Conservative MPs in half a dozen constituencies, knowing that doing so is not going to dramatically increase the risk of the Conservatives returning to Downing Street. So you can send that kind of pro-union message, which is really more of an anti-SNP message, I think, than it is a pro-union one, in those constituencies without risking Rishi Sunak remaining Prime Minister. And so there's this asymmetry where the Tory weakness in England actually helps the Tories in Scotland, in my view. But I, of course, may well be contradicted by events on this.
But I think the same is true for the SNP. I think there are SNP voters who would cast a ballot for Labour if they thought there was a chance there might be a Conservative government that returned. But if it looks like it's a runaway victory for the Labour, for Labour, they will stay and they will park their vote with the SNP. And so I think the polls impact on what people do on the day, more so than in the other three, the three most recent elections we've had.
There's a lot of talk within the political bubble, I think, at the moment over recent months, people whispering, could this be a Canada 93 election, which was when the Canadian Conservatives were reduced to just 2 members of the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. But, I think for people outside the political bubble, they don't really know, well, what is Canada 93? And Ailsa, as I say, you're a bona fide Canadian, and you were at the University of Ottawa, I think, in 1993, weren't you? Perhaps you could talk us through this, because the Canadian Tories had dominated Canadian politics in the 1980s, hadn't they? I mean, I think they'd had a share of the Canadian Parliament that was roughly equivalent to Labour having around 480 seats at Westminster, which is what the Salvation MRP is indicating could be possible. And yet, by 1993, they are reduced to just 2. So could you just sort of give us a little outline, a quick sketch of what actually happened, and what was it that drove the Conservative Party in Canada to this kind of apocalyptic result that has become famous and a sort of shorthand for electoral disaster?
Well, the short answer is that you do need to understand what happened in 1984 and 88, and particularly the fact that the Conservative Party formed a coalition really of conservative-leaning Quebec nationalists on the one hand and conservative populists in the West on the other. And they spent a great deal of the 1980s focusing on Quebec and trying to bring Quebec back into the constitutional fold. They had the Meech Lake Accord, which promised to recognize Quebec as a distinct society, to have an enhanced role for provinces in terms of nominating senators and members of the Supreme Court, and the premiers blocked that. So that was a wasted part of the 80s. And they tried again with the Charlottetown Accord. They tried again to solve the constitutional problems, primarily as it related to Quebec, but also a slightly broader issue for the Charlottetown Accord. And that failed at the hands of a referendum. So having spent about a decade focusing on Quebec, without getting anywhere, those in Quebec felt, you know what, this is just being part of this coalition is not really working for us. So we're gonna leave and we're gonna form our own party. We're gonna form the Bloc Québécois, which was the sister party of the Parti Québécois, which contested seats in provincial elections in Quebec. And at the same time, you had a party in the West who said, I don't think this is working for us either, because you've just spent the past 10 years talking about Quebec and ignoring us. We're going to form our own party. And we're going to pay attention to Western interests. We have a different vision of government, a small government. We're opposed to the federal sales tax, the GST. So you had the creation of 2 new parties and a falling apart of a coalition that the Conservative Party had formed and relied on throughout the 80s. And what happened in that 1993 election is that the Bloc Québécois won 54 of the 75 seats in Quebec. You had Reform winning about 52 seats, mostly in Alberta and BC. So you had an abandonment of one of the 2 national parties to go towards 2 regional parties. And for the rest of the electorate, you had people saying, well, this is just, we've had enough of the Conservative Party. They were just facing classic costs of governing issues. So frustration about the deficit. There'd been a recession in the 80s. People were tired of unemployment going up, the deficit going up. And so they said, right, it's time for a change. So you had these 3 things happen at once. And so to think about what that would look like in a UK context, you would have to imagine that Scotland was much bigger than it was, that Scotland was 25% of the UK. You have to imagine that Wales is much bigger than it is, about 10% of the UK. And you have to imagine that the kind of change you saw in 2015 in Scotland happened in Scotland in this election, but you also have to imagine Wales turning around and saying, you've been doing nothing but talking about Scotland for the last 10 years. And I can imagine people in Wales actually saying, you've been doing nothing but talking about Scotland for the last 10 years. And so they decide that they're going to back a new regional party, like a Plaid Reform company. And so they both defect at the same time. And then everybody in England just goes to Labour. So it's not just a case of government dissatisfaction. It's not just a case of a government paying the costs of governing. It's that layered on with regional alienation, regional governance, and we do regional grievance, and we do have regional grievance in the UK, but it has to manifest itself in these different regional parties. So we've got part of the formula, but not the full formula.
I mean, I don't think anyone really thinks the Tories will be down into single digits in terms of number of MPs. I mean, even these extravagant, these disastrous MRP surveys for them don't suggest that. But at the same time, the possibility of them having their worst election result in more than 100 years is now very real, I think. Yes,
I wasn't sure if that was for Bernard or me. Yes, sorry, I think you might be right. I think you might be right.
Well, it was just a nice little silence there as we contemplate the prospect of the Conservative and Unionist Party toppling over and falling into a deep, deep, deep abyss.
Well, maybe as we wrap it up, Ailsa, what we should do is to let's all give our predictions about what's going to happen and who will win and what size of majority in the UK and who will be the largest party in Scotland. Now, Comrade Massie, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Right, we're all agreeing a Labour victory, right? Okay, that's.
I was going to go out on a limb about that. Yeah. I mean,
majority.
I mean, when you consider where Labour are coming from, it seems preposterous to be talking about a majority of 150, 165. But the way things are going, I would say a majority of, 165 is now possibly at the sort of mid-range of possible plausible outcomes. And I think in Scotland, I would expect the Labour Party to be the largest party, but the SNP to do better than some surveys are currently suggesting. And I think that the SNP will win between 22 and 25 seats, Labour 25, 26, the Tories half a dozen, and the Liberals 3 or 4, and that's probably gets us to more than 57. So I've probably miscounted there, but I would think Labour to have the most seats in Scotland, but the SNP to avoid the worst of all the possible outcomes that are currently being mooted for them. So obviously none of that is going to happen.
But I'm going to say this is absolutely no good because we're agreeing far too much. This is the third episode of this podcast, and we're actually agreeing too much. It's a Labour victory. Yes, it's a landslide. I also, when I sort of you look at the baseline from 2019 and how much ground they have to make up, it just seems astonishing that polls can be saying a majority bigger than Blair, bigger than Attlee in 45. It just does not seem possible. But I think the dynamic of the last 24 hours and Reform UK and Farage's on the BBC debate, apparently, I think that being squeezed by Reform from the right and the Liberal Democrats in certain constituencies in the south puts a really big Labour majority on the cards. I'm going to go for 175 Labour majority. I've plucked it out there. I have to be slightly different from yourself, comrade, so I'm going to go for 175.
But at the same time, it's close enough not to look a complete wally if we're both out by 100, or at least that'll be a misery shared.
But north of the border, I mean, I would have said, even 6 months ago, the idea that at a general election, Labour may well be the largest party starting on 1. The key dynamic here, and Professor Henderson took us through it in great detail. This is the first election in Scotland post-2014 where we're not looking at it through the prism of constitutional options, whether it be independence or Brexit. And, the fallout from 2014 was brilliant for the SNP. It gave the Conservatives an electoral revival without actually doing anything, without actually saying anything, simply banged the drum for the Union. There was a revival of sorts. And I think, therefore, that we're more back in to the 2010 territory where people are actually looking at the numbers in the House of Commons. And on that basis, I think Labour will be the largest party, but not by terribly much. I would go for Labour round about the 30 mark.
And Ailsa?
Ailsa?
I'll go slightly the other way. I'll say a Labour majority of less than 160. I think turnout is going to be a real issue at this election, and that differentially affects different parties. I agree Labour will be the largest party. I think the Conservatives will do better than they did last election, particularly since two of the seats where they're eyeing up a possible vote, those are the two local authorities that are not on holiday at the time of the election. So I think that will advantage them. So I will put it there. Labour will do well. I don't think SNP will be as far behind as people think, but I think the Conservatives will also pick up seats. I think Lib Dems will do much better than they've been predicted to do in the recent MRP models.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Ailsa. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to have you with us. Good luck at the BBC Scotland on election night. I hope you manage to get plenty of sleep during the day before you have to go on air, and have all kinds of sustenance to keep you going through the night. We'll be back at some point in the next few days. Bernard.
Well, just to say, Ailsa, thank you very much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. This is the kind of content where you can really drill down, which you can't do on mainstream television, because all of this is always crammed into sort of 5 or 6 minutes, as I know, because I'm about to go on to Scotland tonight, this evening. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been instructive for people who are out knocking doors, understanding what's going on in the polls. This is what this podcast in partly is about. It's about allowing issues to breathe and hopefully informing the public discourse. So thank you once again, Ailsa, for your time.
Thank you.